I'd like to welcome everyone to this panel discussion on my book, Kwaito Bodies, Remastering Space and Subjectivity in Post-Apartheid South Africa. And I thought we'd just begin with some brief introductions of each of the panelists, starting with Tayo.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tayo Jalaucho. My pronouns are they, them, they are theirs. And I am a cultural anthropologist who does research at the intersections of embodiment, performance, and politics. And currently, I am working on an ethnography of a South African social movement organization known as the Anti-Privatization Forum. It was one of the quote-unquote new social movements emerging in post-1994 South Africa. I teach at the University of South Florida in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies, and I'm just happy to be here to talk about Kwaito Bodies.
Thank you. And Vusi?
Hi, nice to meet you, Tayo. Name is Vusi. I'm a art writer based in Cape Town, a founder editor of an arts publication called Iliso Magazine, and just an all-round creative artist, producing work, engaged in contemporary arts, part-time, teaching short-term at a Cape Town Creative Academy. Nice to be here.
Okay, thank you. And I'm Xavier Liverman. I am currently an associate professor of feminist studies and critical race and ethnic studies at University of California, Santa Cruz. I'm just really ultimately interested in Black creativity, music, and popular culture. And particularly, I think it's intersections with gender and sexuality. And while most of that work has been focused on South Africa, I've done some of that work outside in other diasporic spaces in the U.S., in Afro-Europe, and et cetera. So I'm also just happy to be here and happy to engage. As I was telling the panelists, you never know how things are going to be received. So it's really nice to just kind of have this opportunity to dialogue and talk about the work. So with that, I will turn things over to Tayo for some reflections, conversations, maybe to just get us started.
So I am really interested to actually hear, I'm going to turn it to Vusi. Because I wanna hear about your experience as someone who grew up with Kwaito, who is a co-creator, co-producer within this practice, and just to hear about your experience and to hear about how the book was reading and sounding to you.
Cool. One of the when I learned about the book from a mutual friend that we have, Giovanni, and when we spoke a bit about it, my interest, I've been waiting. He actually bought me a book about a month ago, and we're still waiting for it to arrive. My interest in the book was how it centers the body. And the body and how it thinks about, not only the creators, right, in this sense now, the artists, but also the people that consume the art, right, sort of move in the space in which the art lives or is produced, and that really resonated with me, because so there's always this, this idea, this conversation in cultural spaces in the country around whether Kwaito is dead or not. Right. We get varying responses to that. Right. But really, I find it to be an unproductive kind of question because we speak the language. Right. We dress that way. It's in the way in which we dress, in the way in which we talk, even outside of the music itself. Right. So it becomes a way in which we live. And so it has, not only has it informed, our notions of, our masculine identities, but it's also informed, our, sort of sensibilities as far as, music is concerned. And, so it was always a thing that was always around, and it became for me, even today, it's like a childhood, background music, so to speak. So it's part and parcel of, my own lived experiences as a child, who started school like late 90s, 99, 98, around there. So I can't think of my childhood outside of Kwaito. I can't think of local slang known as Tsotsital or Flang, outside of Kwaito, because it brought that thing to me. I can't think of, my earlier, cinematic experiences, right, in the form of Yizo Yizo, and how those, cinematic experiences informed how we, as boys in primary school at the time, right, started relating to one another and thinking about our own, masculine identities, and in those quite formative and, and fragile, kind of spaces, thinking how we can think of, being black boys and how they're assuming that, sort of identities, and how it came with certain markers, right? I think that I wanted to bring up in this conversation, and how we had been marked a certain way, right? Because we spoke a certain, vernac, right? Certain social spaces, even amongst black people, certain social spaces, that language was stigmatized, how we dressed a certain way, a Panama, a Converse, and it was in a way criminalized to certain spaces, right? So it's not this glossy, romantic, idea that has come to, quite nostalgic ways, right? Has come to be associated with this, with Kwaito. There was a lot. It's a really complicated thing. And I think also the book sort of deals with those nuances in one way or the other. But I think that was a very long answer to your question. But yeah.
No, I really appreciate that, and I don't know, Tayo, if you had some thoughts, based off of what Vusi says.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really interesting that, Vusi, you started with this question, is Kwaito dead, right? And you went to this space where, like, now Kwaito lives in a space of nostalgia. Right? And that has, I don't know if you follow me in terms of, but it seems that's what you were suggesting, right? In terms of, like, it harkens back to your childhood. You can't imagine your childhood outside of Kwaito. And so it raises questions about, like, what this current moment, like, in what contemporary moment are we stepping into, right? Because, in the book, Kwaito is very much alive, right? And when we're talking about nostalgia, we're talking about, like, 1950s Sophia Town nostalgia for that past, right? So now, like, what does it mean that Kwaito is that which, we have nostalgic yearnings for? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I don't know if I should respond to it or we just keep it moving.
No.
Respond.
Yeah, respond.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, there's a generation that comes, in the, let's say, post 2010, 2011, which we begin to see the emergence of other sort of subcultures or cultures just in the form of hip hop and other various, cultural formations that have come to contest Kwaito, right, in one way or the other. So there's this idea, right, that Kwaito has been associated with a certain kind of authenticity that, these American, are perceived as American sort of sounds or cultural productions are not thought of, right? So this idea that, in us assuming, this global cultural export, which is hip hop, we're losing something, we're losing a Kwaito that was authentically ours, right? So there's a longing for a time in which Kwaito was quite dominant. There's a longing for a time where Kwaito was central to the ways in which we live, right? In ways that I must admit they've sort of been, in one way or the other, sort of been decentered, right? And so the conversation of whether it's dead or not, it's actually, the conversation around nostalgia is not that it's non-existent. right? But there's a feeling that it's no longer as central as it used to be, and young people now, who are in the teenage years now, wouldn't speak of Kwaito in the same way that I would speak of Kwaito. They would speak of hip hop and other forms of cultural exports from other parts of the country, well, other parts of the world and parts of the country as well, with Amapiano, which are in one way or the other an evolution of Kwaito, right? But that's a conversation for another day.
No,
another day, right? So I was speaking of nostalgia in this way, not as a thing that is extinct, right, that exists in another time, but as a thing that has been in one way, in some ways, right, been dissented in some way, and so long as central as it used to be.
Yeah, I think it's a couple of interesting things that, and I'm gonna try to riff off of both of what y'all said. I definitely think that I appreciate your discussion of the body, and particularly the body of those who were consuming, and kind of what I use, or what performance studies uses, as the framework of co-producing the culture, right? Because I felt that so much of what was written about Kwaito was so focused on the musicians, or on deciphering what the musicians were doing. And of course I do some of that. Like I mean, that's there in the book, right? But at the end of the day, I really was like, it's not like I'm a musician. It's not like I was, hanging out with, the musicians. I was hanging out with the people who were consuming. And I felt that perspective, was not represented in a lot of the scholarly literature, nor frankly even in a lot of the popular literature, right? And so I really wanted to kind of speak to that, and I really wanted to talk about how, like what you're saying, Vusi, the conversation about whether it still exists or not, I didn't find as productive as the conversation about how it laid the foundation for a lot of what we see today, right? And so that was, one of the things that I really wanted to speak about. And to that extent, I would make arguments that music such as Gom and, to a lesser extent Amapiano, but they're related, right? They're like cousins, or, they're not exactly Kwaito, of course, but, they come from the genealogy of Kwaito in many ways. And then, with respect to, I think, this idea of nostalgia, I would agree 100% with you that I think that nostalgia is for, this time when Kwaito was more dominant in the popular culture and the popular imaginary. But I also think it's interesting to think about if you will, allow me to just kind of take an Afro-diasporic frame. I mean, when I think about something like dancehall, it's constantly renewed by different sounds and different ways of imagination. And as younger people come in, they want to associate with reggae or call what they're doing dancehall. And I've seen the same thing with hip hop here in the United States. Like, I don't personally think contemporary trap music sounds anything like, the hip hop of the 70s or 80s, right? Like it doesn't sound, and yet the people who enter into that space want to make a claim of that space. They're not saying, oh, we're doing something completely different, right? I mean, they may have a name for it, right? But they're very much interested in being a part of the hip hop, or, seeing their music as being engaged in hip hop. And I've always found this really interesting tension with younger musicians or people coming up post 94 with to use a word I use in the book, a sort of disidentification from Kwaito, saying like, I don't do Kwaito, I do this, right? And it was always strange to me, because I thought, well, if hip hop can have both the roots and, future, right? Why can't Kwaito? And I know that, that was part of the conversation of groups like Bongo Muffin, who were making it really clear. They were saying, look, if you can have the roots in Erykah Badu, you can also, and you can have Dr. Dre, we can also be a part of this. So I found that their approach to like their understanding of how they fit into Kwaito at, you know, at that time in the 90s and early aughts to be refreshing. And I want to ask you, Vusi, just from a cultural creative standpoint, what do you perceive as the desire to kind of disidentify from Kwaito in some ways? Like, why do you, or do you even see that as a thing? And if so, do you have a sense as to why that would be the case, or is there some other movement happening? And I know, Tayo, you wanted to jump in, so I will shut up.
Yeah.
It's all good.
I mean, in the Kwaito scene currently, you do have groups like Darky Fiction, right? That are current young groups, right? That are producing Kwaito, you know, and it doesn't, you know, I would say what they're doing would be similar to young people doing, you know, what's the sort of KRS one kind of sound? What's it called?
I don't know, like,
boom
bap, like old school hip hop,
yeah. So that would be seen like young people doing that kind of sound, right? So there seems to be a pushback between that younger group that is producing that sort of work, which you know, it's not as lucrative as it used to be, right? Or it should be. And then there seems to be then, you know, this attempt, you know, even within the hip hop space, right? You have artists like Questa, you have artists like Casper Nyovest, that are trying to find ways in which to fuse, you know, hip hop, and Kwaito into like one thing, right? You know, you have the Durban Kwaito scene, which sounds more club-ish house, with a fusion of you know, but creating something that sounds like Kwaito, right? But I think the biggest factor currently now, I'd say, you know, on top of my head would be it's not as lucrative as it used to be. And secondly, there's this idea that, you know, young people are trying to, you know, to create, you know, using Kwaito as a foundation, right? But to create new forms of cultural production. And it seems to be, Kwaito seems to be the thing that, you know, might box them in some way. You know, like, you know, when you have artists like Kid X, who works with Questa, you know, who's often, you know, referred to, you know, like as a Kwaito artist, and, you know, and he doesn't want to contest in that space, right? He wants to contest in the hip hop space, you know, so he would, you know, frequently, you know, sort of articulate that he's not there, he's trying to produce this sort of sound, you know, but because of certain, you know, aesthetic elements that are in the music that are quite foundational to his music, he's easily associated with Kwaito and sort of, you know, sort of this idea of this pushback against it. But I think it's this, you know, to run away from narrow labeling would be the first thing. But secondly, because really, I don't think it's as lucrative as it used to be. That could be another thing. But an argument I think could also be contested. Yeah.
So I want to probe this question of embodiment a little bit more. I mean, it's my favorite theory. So, like, I want to talk about how embodiment appears in the book, in terms of the Kwaito body, and we've already talked about how, you know, understanding Kwaito not just as tied to the music, right, or not just as tied to a musical analysis, but as, you know, extending from, you know, this kind of separated medium, artificially separated medium of music from life, right, from questions of everyday life. We get into embodiment in that way, right, because we talk about language, we talk about dress, we talk about, you know, sensibilities, right? So music extending from all of those things. And I just wonder, so embodiment, especially in terms of the embodiment theory that I'm coming in from, takes seriously issues of aesthetics. The aesthetics not just as like artistic production or standards of artistic production, but aesthetics as connected to sensory making, right? The sensorial. So the sensorial, in terms of the lived experience, the felt experiences of the body, right? And often when we talk about the body or we talk about embodiment, it's kind of this external perspective that's taking place, right? The body as observed, right? As opposed to the body as lived, as felt through, as experienced, right? And so I was just wanting Xavier or Vusi, either of you, just to talk about how that experience, that idea of embodiment as the body's lived experience, factors into the interventions of Kwaito body.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. That is actually a really challenging kind of question for me to speak to, but I think there were two things that I really wanted to kind of really talk about or think about. Is that I really was trying to get away from, I think, I'm dating myself a bit, but when I was in grad school in the early aughts, I was really trying to get away from what I felt was this turn in discussions of embodiment towards the body as text.
Yeah.
Right. And sort of this need to observe the body and read the body like you would read a textual document, right? And I really tried, and I'm not, I think there are limits to my analysis, limits to, my theorizing, but I tried as much as possible in various different iterations of the text to really try to get at how I was feeling when things, without sort of devolving into affect theory, right? But really try to get into kind of like how I was feeling and how people were describing how they were feeling, in these moments when they were experiencing different kinds of joy and pleasure. And I felt like that was the only way for me to communicate the joy and the pleasure of what was happening in those spaces and times. I didn't feel that a kind of either a disembodied reading or a body as text reading would be able to help me account for that. So it was really about me trying to push my own methodological practice ethnographically, like to really just push myself to do some of that uncomfortable work that did in some ways require centering of my body in certain kinds of ways, right?
Yeah.
And trying to do a good job of like centering that experience without making it kind of like the experience qua non, so to speak, right? Like that it wasn't just, but also trying to be really honest from a political perspective about the fact that I, as a researcher, don't disappear from this text, right? Yeah. Like what's being written is really being heavily influenced by who I am as a person. And I think I ran away from that. Like if you are to find the dissertation somewhere, you'll see that the dissertation looks quite different, right? And I think that initially I was really running away from my own embodiment. And even while trying to be a quote unquote, self-reflexive researcher. And so when I rewrote this, taking into account my embodiment, it became a different text. And honestly, if I had another 6 months, I think it would have even been something different still. It's just, I couldn't do as much of that introspection. So that was my feeling about embodiment, but I am curious, Vusi, as to what you think.
I mean, I was going to get us to speak a bit about that actually, because I was really interested in what you would have to say. But I think your contribution is quite valuable. Sort of answer some of the things that I wanted to ask or rather probe. But it was in relation to the way in which I was thinking about what I thought you were thinking when you were introducing or reinserting the body as central to the theorizing, right? And in how, Black American theorist George Yancey talks about this idea of reasoning from the body, right? Not reasoning from nowhere, right? And putting the body, as central to theory, right? As a sort of primary, point of departure. And also just thinking about, getting your sense of that tension, as a perceived outsider or as an outsider, right, to the thing, even though you also acknowledge that you had participated in it, right? But then as someone who's not from Soweto, who's not from Khayelitsha, who's not from Sweden, all South African townships, would be perceived as an outsider to the thing, right? But then taking your body as an outsider and then placing yourself at the center of your arguments, I thought that was quite generative, and I think it opens quite interesting critical portals, right, that will allow us to explore the sort of hegemonic, problematics, right? As someone from North America coming to write in the so-called global South, what then does the centering of your body, do to that contradiction, to that, we've seen filmmakers, scholars, researchers come to the continent, come to the country, and centering themselves in the discourse, But it was also interesting in how you acknowledge that, right? And also, I think you also mentioned that, you want to, well, not these are the exact words, but I got the impression that you want to own up to whatever mistakes that you would make, right? Yeah. So whatever analytic limitations that could arise. Like if anyone needs to be dragged, then it's you. No. So that was brave, but I wanted to get how you felt about that and centering yourself and thinking about those sort of unequal hegemonic or questions of hegemony, really, as far as the research is concerned, as far as your structural positionality is concerned. Not forgetting also how your experiences with the police and how they also complicate.
Oh, yes.
But I wanted to get a sense of that from you.
And before you go ahead, if I may jump in so that we can all drag Xavier. I'm kidding.
I'm here for it.
Let's just say if this were happening live in Cape Town, there would be plenty of dragging. But, that's just because we like dragging. Dragging is a form of affection. Here you go.
Definitely.
So I want to talk about, before you respond, I actually do want to talk about the limitations of embodied methodologies and theory, right? And that might add some layers to your responses too, Xavier. So the book that you wrote is very much written from the body, right? And I can affirm that, right from your very first lines, right? It's sensual, it's sensorial, right? It evokes, sensory experiences, right? Like in terms of being able to walk with you along the street, being able to, evoke those sounds, the smells, like, all of these sensory experiences, through which the body is interpreting events, right? And that is, a methodology, of embodiment. And so you were talking about, Vusi, about like reasoning from the body. And so writing from the body as well, right, becomes this place of, getting into embodiment on paper. Yeah. And part of the limitations or the constraints that, that comes in doing this work is that you cannot directly present or you cannot directly access someone else's embodied experiences. Right? And so your body becomes the tool, like your own body becomes the tool of access, because your job is not to, directly transmit, but to evoke what's possible, what might be, And so as much as we celebrate embodiment, right, when we acknowledge this limitation, that I can't directly experience what you're feeling, Vusi, then it's about how do you get around this, how do you be honest and try to, and so, yeah, the goal is not necessarily direct transmission, but the evocation, of sensory possibilities.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Tyle, for that. I mean, I certainly would not have expressed it as beautifully and eloquently as you did. But I agree. I mean, I think that was what I was trying to get at, was that that these are the limitations, I think, of any kind of ethnographic practice, right? Whether embodied, disembodied, whatever, right? That there are limitations to that. And I think that one of the things that I wanted to be really sensitive about with this project was that I did not want to, as much as possible, right? I mean, the end of the day, I'm a North American researcher from a relatively privileged institution. Actually, I would say a very privileged institution, right? Doing this work because I have the funding and capacity to do it, right? And so I always wanted to be very sensitive to the fact that, as someone who was a cultural outsider, but could slip in and out. I mean, there was something about my Blackness, even with my outsiderness, that allowed me to slip in and out in certain ways. Not in the same way as if I were doing something on hip hop in the US, of course, right? And so I just wanted to, as much as possible, account for that. And I wanted to be as humble as I could possibly be with this work. I was never trying to make this authoritative in that particular kind of way. I was not invested in turfing, right? Or saying that it just should be, that this is about making myself some kind of expert. It was always about, this is something that I encountered with a particular kind of generosity, right? Just in my own lived experience. And I wanted to be able to approach it with that same level of generosity and humility with which it was given to me, and how I was able to receive it. And so I hope that comes across, right? And I definitely know that, I may have misread something. There are limitations to what my body can understand and interpret, and make sense of. And so, I definitely, wanted to, and I think I want to be distinct here. It wasn't to ward off legitimate criticism of the text, right? So it wasn't like I was just trying to sort of here's a caveat, and that, by giving that caveat, I am now, preventing any kind of legitimate, criticism of the text. Rather, it was more to say, to be as honest as I possibly could about my positionality and my limitations, and frankly, the larger limitations of the enterprise of ethnography itself and of embodied ethnography itself. So it was a dual thing, right? It was an individual acknowledgement of limitations, but it was also a kind of epistemological, I guess, or kind of methodological, acknowledgement of limitations. And I tried to work with both of those. So that, at the end of the day, I acknowledge I might have got some things wrong, but I hope that, certainly anything that I said is open to reinterpretation and disagreement, right? But it was always to say that hopefully I've approached that with a certain level of humility, so that the criticisms that come, whatever they may be, are done with the same level of generosity that I try to approach this. And the last thing that I'll just say is that, from my perspective, it's my hope that, the numerous texts that are starting to come out about Kwaito generate more people to see this as a space for engaging critically and analytically, whether they do so within the academy or not, right? I think that, I think that one of the things that has consistently been a problem in the South African popular cultural sphere is that it's oftentimes not Black South Africans themselves who are writing about their own popular cultures. And I think that does need to change, right? And so this was also, I think, part of my approach was also about was both about this weird centering and decentering of myself, or centering myself with an acknowledgement of the limitations of that, right? For the hopes that, you know, it would bring on, you know, I think a set of conversations that would ideally lead to folks doing more work in research and commentary, you know, for themselves. So that's the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested in the way in which I mean, I like this idea of centering and decentering, inserting and removing yourself. And I was really interested in the ways in which, or your attempts to avoid any easy binaries, right? Any binary thought, right? You know, and how you think around, for instance, the concept of remastery. I don't know if you have time to get into that. But there was great space that was opened, you know, by you avoiding the spectacular, you know, moments of thinking about, you know, such a grand thing called Kwaito, but really zooming in on, you know, like the sort of banal moments of being in camp. You know, there was interesting moments that kind of opened for you, you know, and how, you know, you ended up talking about, you know, the minibus taxis, for instance, right? And I almost stood up and clapped. I was like, oh shit, this is, like, this is dope. And it got me thinking, for instance, I don't know if you were also thinking about that. I'd also try and get your sense of that. And how, the scholar Fred Morton talks about this idea, you know, certain spaces like barbershops and saloons, you know, how they become central to cultural production and the production of knowledge, right? And you then inserting the minibus taxis, you know, not only as a thing that transported it, but as a space in which it was contested and, you know, spoken about and recreated and critiqued, you know, then became sites of critiques, right? How then was it important for you to sort of center those sort of banal moments and sort of, you know, insignificant space as sites of criticism or critique and reflection?
Yeah, so I think part of that also informs the diasporic framework that I use to try to think about these conversations, which kind of required my body to be like, you know, part of the experience of diaspora is that experience of both misrecognition and recognition simultaneously, right? And so I definitely think that a lot of my experiences were about that. And I think, I hate to say that even that came from my embodied experience. I think some of that was also just the training that I was receiving, you know, the people that I was working with who were kind of encouraging me to think beyond binaristic thinking. But honestly, some of it was like the lived experience of being in South Africa as this Black person who was consistently, like, I was like, these binaries don't work because they're not certainly working on my body, right? Like, I'm not always the foreigner. I'm not always you know what I'm saying? I'm not, you know, there are times where I'm just blending in and no one even notices who the hell I am, right? Or I'm not blending in, but the way in which I stick out is not violent or, you know what I'm saying, or hierarchical or whatever, right? And so I wanted to always, so I think that experience of doing the research and being in these spaces informed the need for me to go back and reimagine my theory, right? And to really do that thing that I think a lot of folks who are trained in ethnography, whether they be anthropologists or performance theorists or however they kind of approach, when they're being told to kind of theorize from the ethnography, you know, like I really took that seriously. And so I think that really made me realize, like, I have to, as much as possible, try to imagine my practice both theoretically and methodologically outside of certain binaristic thinking. And I think that I would actually say that the framework that I would use is this: I was interested in the vernacular and the everyday, and I was fortunate, I think, as a researcher to be able to live that at various different moments. You know, I know researchers who don't ride taxis that often, right? And so, but I was in them basically every day, right, for years,
Yeah.
and so that required me to like kind of, and so much, I mean, for me, it was a site of knowledge and critique and, and all of these things. And then I would hear the conversations, and of course, there are limitations to my language abilities, right? But I clearly heard like, okay, people are talking about this or they're talking about that. There's a debate, right? There's contestation happening here. And I think that, that kind of just informed my interest in looking at the everyday, right? I mean, I know that you use the word banal, but I think I kind of prefer the everyday as the framework. But I think that they're speaking to the same thing, right? But it was like, and that's not to say there weren't moments where I wanted to look at the spectacular, but so much of this was about, sort of everyday experiences and those things that people don't look at. And honestly, maybe, me not being, right, from South Africa made those things maybe slightly more spectacular for me than they would have otherwise been, for a local researcher. And I'm definitely will cop up to, even for me, maybe sometimes when I started writing about these things, I didn't think of them as so banal, right? But I think that at some point, I don't know, in your 500th ride in a taxi, it becomes that, right? I mean, no matter how interesting or unusual it was your first or second time, by the time, as basically as an American, right? And I also think it depends on what kind of background you come from the U.S. as well, right? Like, I mean, there wasn't anything that I was seeing in taxis in South Africa that wouldn't be on like a bus in an urban, space in the U.S., right? In some ways, right? Like, I mean, obviously, all fairness, controlling for history, culture, socioeconomics, et cetera, right? But I think it also had trained, like my own life before I even ever set foot in South Africa had kind of trained me to think about these everyday practices and I guess kind of larger, just what is urban vernacular life, right? I guess I was trained to think about that already. So,
Can I come in on questions of power, which I don't really know that it's resolvable, right? And, power needs to remain a constant critique, right? In terms of power differentials. The power differentials embedded in ethnographic fieldwork, right? So I guess my question is, to what extent, and it's not really a question, but I guess observations, right? To what extent is this complicated by Blackness as as an Afro-diasporic, practice of solidarity and possibility, right? I mean, you're already, Xavier, talking about connections in Black urban spaces in the U.S. And in South Africa. And so if there are these connections, what does it mean to be an outsider, right, to Black South African cultural practices, right? I would infer that, it's not exactly the same if you were not Black, right? And then, we also have to bring gender into this as well. And so, with your police stoppages, I mean, I have had encounters. So, let me just talk about my positionality. I'm originally from Nigeria. I've lived in the U.S. for, 20 plus years. And, I have American citizenship. And so I come into South Africa as very much, an outsider as well, but I can also pull on Pan-African solidarity. But on top of that, I manifest as a woman, even though I don't identify as a woman. And so And so my police encounters are, quite different, right? Like it did not end in me being arrested, for example. And my tools of encounter are quite different from yours, Xavier, or from yours, Vusi. And so, it's also complicated by gender as well, in terms of how we belong, right? In places of, in diasporic places of Blackness.
Yeah, and I tried as much as possible to keep that conversation as complicated and nuanced, and messy, right, as possible, because it was in real lived experience. I try, and I think that there were numerous vectors of power, right? So of course there's the vector of power between the researcher and the researched, right? There's the vector of power of me being cis presenting man, right? There's, a vector and power of me being American, so nationality, right? Just even the fact that I'm speaking primarily in English, and it's an accented English that in the South African context has a certain kind of power, right? Not sure it has the same power in the UK, let's say, but in the South African context, speaking English with an American accent in the early aughts was a cool thing. I'm not sure if it's such a cool thing now, but but it certainly was at the time that I was doing research, right? And particularly if you're talking about nightclub spaces and parties, right, which is where I was at in kind of social spaces. So I tried as much as possible in the book to acknowledge that, but to also not pretend as if there's something happening in the book or even in my research practice that completely resolves it, right? I agree with you, Tayo. I don't know if they can be completely resolved. And I think that's why even when it was uncomfortable, I tried as much as possible to infuse the text with as much transparency as I could, right? And so that was my sense of how I tried to deal with the power relations, while also I think wanting to remind the reader that I wasn't just some white boy from Harvard that was running around South Africa. Gosh, I hope that doesn't anger anybody listening to this, but that I just, that I wasn't, that there was also something in solidarity with, or there were some things that were similar to my positionality and folks that I was engaging with, and that there may have been times where, they were able to invoke a bit more power over me, right? Because of my lack of certain kinds of power in relationship to being able to claim African identity or national, identity or ethno-linguistic identity, etc. So I tried to keep all of that in mind, right? As well as the fact that, I was also moving through all of this as relatively openly queer, right? And what that meant in different spaces as well. So I tried to always keep mind of what those power differentials could look like, while also not attempting to make any claim to fully resolve them, right? And to kind of lay them as bare as I could in the text, so that, the reader would see and understand that.
Hi everyone, Tayo here. This concludes the first part of the conversation between Xavier, myself, and Vusi. Join us for part 2, where we continue the dialogue on Afro-diasporic solidarity. We question Xavier on his use of remastering, and we explore the economic dimensions of Kwaito. All this and much more in part 2.